Margaret Wilson woke up in her small apartment in the New York suburbs, irritated by the sound of her alarm clock. She prepared to catch the commuter train and had her usual simple breakfast. To her family, her life as a clerk at an insurance company appeared to be ordinary at best. Her income as a general office clerk was certainly not substantial. But there was a secret no one knew. Margaret ran a popular YouTube channel called Healing Hearts, where she had built an online community for survivors of emotional abuse. Her videos had been viewed millions of times, and her words resonated with many viewers. However, her family knew nothing about this. Her father, Robert, was a successful real estate developer. He owned vast tracts of land in upstate New York and had developed one luxury residential area after another. His company, Wilson Estates, was one of the most highly regarded real estate companies in the region. He was always a perfectionist with a strong obsession with success. Since Margaret was a child, Robert had imposed strict standards on her and criticized her mercilessly when she failed to meet them. Her mother, Evelyn, had been a model in her youth. Even now, she maintained her elegance and beauty, occupying an important position in local society. But behind that beautiful exterior was a coldness. She demanded that her daughters succeed as women, and when Margaret began to show more interest in social issues than academics, she called it wasted potential. Margaret's younger sister, Victoria, worked as the public relations director at their father's company. She was living the life her family expected, graduating from a prestigious university, working at her father's company, and now about to marry James Anderson, the son of a prominent local family. The relationship between Victoria and Margaret was complicated. The younger sister had always been her parents' favorite and looked down on her older sister as a failure. Margaret picked up her cell phone and checked a message from her sister about the wedding invitation. She let out a long sigh. 2 years ago, she had ended her 5-year marriage to David. Her family believed she had been abandoned because she was infertile, and they repeatedly blamed her for this perceived flaw. "You still haven't replied," Victoria's message read. "I hope you're not planning to ruin my special day. Don't talk about your miserable divorce in front of everyone. James's family is refined." Margaret finished reading the message and gave a dark smile. She moved to the window and looked at the certificates and plaques arranged on her living room wall. Through her online activities, she had built a reputation as an advocate for survivors of emotional abuse and had even established a non-profit organization. However, she had never told her family about this. At a small desk in the corner of the room, she wrote a reply to the wedding reception invitation. "Of course I'll attend," she wrote. "I'm also making special preparations for the family." Margaret picked up her smartphone and opened a special app. The screen displayed the words, "Healing Hearts Live," with the status ready underneath. She took a deep breath. Behind her decision to attend her sister's wedding reception was a plan. Her family believed her ex-husband David was a dropout who was still struggling. In reality, David had become the executive of a successful technology company. The real reason for their divorce was completely different from what her family assumed. Margaret opened her closet and took out a modest navy blue dress. This would be her weapon. It was inconspicuous, wouldn't draw attention, but was the perfect attire to unleash the truth hidden in her smartphone. She had kept from her family the fact that her YouTube channel, Healing Hearts, now had over 1 million supporters and that her non-profit organization supporting victims of emotional abuse was thriving. For 2 years, she had been collecting evidence for this day and had also made legal preparations. Margaret checked her cell phone one last time and confirmed an email from her lawyer. She nodded slightly at the message that read, "All preparations are complete." "I won't run away anymore," she quietly told herself. It's time to reveal the truth. The ballroom of the Grand Palace, a luxury hotel in Westchester County, was lavishly decorated for Victoria and James's wedding reception. Crystal chandeliers sparkled from the ceiling, and white and gold flowers adorned each table. Local dignitaries had gathered to celebrate the union of the Wilson and Anderson families. Margaret paused at the entrance to the venue. She had chosen her navy blue dress to blend in among the flashy outfits. She checked her smartphone and took a quiet deep breath. You finally came. Turning around, Margaret saw Evelyn standing there in perfect makeup and an expensive champagne gold dress. She looked her daughter up and down, frowning slightly. You could have dressed up a bit more, she said. This is a special day. Everyone is watching. Margaret gave a gentle smile. Where's Victoria? At the head table, of course. You're at table 8, with the relatives, Evelyn said, disappearing into the crowd. Margaret headed to her assigned seat. At the table sat distant relatives and employees of her father's company. She greeted them quietly and took a sip of water. The voice of the reception's MC echoed throughout the venue. Victoria and James appeared on the dance floor and began dancing to a sweet Ed Sheeran tune. Victoria's pure white wedding dress was adorned with beads, reflecting light with her every move. James gazed at her lovingly. Margaret observed quietly. In her hand, her smartphone vibrated slightly. A message displayed, ready. After the dance, food was served and champagne glasses were filled. Then came time for speeches. Robert Wilson stood up first and said, "We are honored to welcome the Anderson family." His speech was short and not sentimental, but there was obvious pride in his voice. My daughter Victoria has always been our pride. She has the talent and beauty that does justice to the Wilson name. Margaret picked up her wine glass and took a sip. Her eyes slowly scanned the room, settling on the projector and screen set up. Evelyn's speech centered on herself and her own youthful beauty. Victoria has inherited my beauty, she said, and the audience laughed politely. Then Victoria stood up. She looked around at the audience with a sparkling smile. Today is the happiest day of my life, she said. I want to thank everyone who supported me. Especially my parents, thank you for showing me the perfect model of life. She glanced once in Margaret's direction, curling her lips slightly. And I've prepared a special presentation, Victoria continued. A slideshow of family memories. The venue lights dimmed, and the screen brightened. The first few slides were photos of Victoria from childhood to the present. Beautiful, successful, always surrounded by her parents. And let me share a little about my sister, Margaret, Victoria said. The screen changed, and there in large letters it displayed, Margaret Wilson, infertile, failed marriage, high school dropout, low income, single. Giggles arose from the venue, gradually turning into loud laughter. Margaret's photo was projected on the screen. Margaret didn't move. Her expression didn't change, but internally she thought, it's begun. Victoria seemed to be enjoying the audience's reaction. Don't laugh too much. She'll cry, she joked. The venue erupted in even louder laughter. Evelyn took a sip of wine, staring ahead expressionlessly. There was a faint light of pleasure in her eyes. Robert chuckled and whispered to James's father sitting next to him, just a joke, right? Margaret slowly stood up. The laughter continued but gradually subsided as people noticed her standing. May I say a few words too? She asked in a quiet voice. Victoria looked confused. This wasn't part of the plan. Of course. But please keep it short. Margaret took out her smartphone. Let's begin, she said. She tapped something, and suddenly the venue's screen changed. It displayed the words, Healing Hearts Live, the reality of emotional abuse by family, and a viewer counter. The number rapidly increased, exceeding 1 million. The venue fell silent. At the same time, a chat box appeared in the corner of the screen, with messages streaming in. One stood out particularly. A message from David, the evidence is gathered. The legal team is standing by. You are not alone anymore. Margaret smiled gently. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Let me tell you a little about what I know about the Wilson family. Victoria turned pale and looked toward her parents. Evelyn dropped her glass, and Robert half rose from his chair. "What are you trying to do?" he said in a low voice. "Just telling the truth," she answered. "The truth everyone has been wanting to hear." Margaret's hands weren't trembling. Her eyes were filled with firm determination. She was finally about to unleash her voice that had been suppressed for years. In that moment, she knew that she wasn't the family's failure, but had become the voice of a million people. The smartphone screen continued to show the live broadcast, and comments kept increasing. Silence dominated the room. Margaret stood in the center of the venue, her back straight. Her voice was calm, but her words were ice cold. "Hello to the million people watching this moment live. I am Margaret Wilson. Today, I break my silence." Victoria half rose and shouted, "What kind of joke is this? Stop it right now." Margaret stared at her sister and said, "A joke? You like jokes, Victoria. Especially making fun of me." She tapped the screen of her smartphone and pressed a button. Audio began to play through the venue's speakers. "Hey, Mom, why can't Margaret have children?" Victoria's voice. "Her body is broken, just like her life," Evelyn's cold laugh. "David was right to abandon her. Men want to leave descendants. Margaret can't do anything." As the recorded conversation continued, Margaret directed the camera at the audience, zooming in on Robert, Evelyn, and Victoria's faces. All three had turned pale. James wore a confused expression and had moved his chair slightly away from his fiancée. "This is what I recorded at a family Christmas gathering," Margaret explained. "A conversation when I stepped away. But there's more." In the next recording, Robert's voice resonated, "Margaret is a failure. Victoria is my real daughter. Margaret was just a mistake." Evelyn stood up and shouted, "Stop it. This is eavesdropping, it's illegal." Margaret calmly replied, "No, Mother. In New York State, recording is legal if one participant in the conversation consents. I consented. And for the abuse I received directly, I am my own witness." She began playing another video from her smartphone. It showed 16-year-old Margaret. She was returning home from a piano concert, happily reporting, "I got second place." "You mean you lost?" Robert says. "The Wilsons are never second. It's either first or nothing." The smile disappears from young Margaret's face. "Second out of 25, Dad." "Loser," he says and leaves the room. The atmosphere in the venue began to change. Uncomfortable whispers started among the guests, and many people looked ill at ease. James's parents were visibly disturbed and were talking to each other in hushed voices. Margaret continued. "Throughout my life, I've experienced thousands of such moments. I've constantly been called a loser, defective, disgrace. But the most cruel was the mockery about my infertility and divorce." She looked up at the screen. To all viewers, many of you have had similar experiences. Emotional abuse from family is difficult to see and prove. That's why I launched Healing Hearts, to collect the voices of abuse survivors and create a community to support them. At these words, Robert suddenly stood up. "What nonsense. You've always tried to seek attention. You're ruining Victoria's special day." "Attention?" Margaret quietly laughed. "Dad, I have 1 million followers on YouTube. My book will be published next month. I run a nationwide nonprofit organization. If I wanted attention, I would have had it long ago." The venue fell silent. Surprise spread across Robert and Evelyn's faces. They knew nothing about their daughter's success. "You thought I was a low-wage clerk, with a failed marriage, and a defective woman who couldn't have children," Margaret said. "That's because I let you think so. Because I knew that if you knew about my success, you would try to ruin it." Her voice grew stronger. "And what you know about David is also wrong." At that moment, the doors to the venue opened. A tall, confident man entered. It was David Clark. The once awkward young man had transformed into a sophisticated businessman. He walked straight toward Margaret. A murmur arose from the venue. Evelyn sank into her chair, and Robert blushed. David stood next to Margaret and placed his hand on her shoulder. "Margaret, I didn't divorce you because you were infertile. I couldn't bear your family's abuse anymore. But that was my weakness. I'm sorry I left you alone." He looked around the venue. "I am now the executive of a technology company. After divorcing Margaret, I was inspired by her courage. Seeing her recover from her family's abuse helped me rebuild my own life." He pointed at the screen. "In fact, I've been secretly supporting Margaret's nonprofit organization for survivors of emotional abuse. I've been waiting for the day she would bravely stand up." Suddenly, several people stood up at the back of the venue. They were members of Margaret's online community. They nodded toward Margaret, showing their support. "We are here with Margaret," one woman said. "Her courage has given us the power to reclaim our own voices." Victoria stood frozen in her wedding dress. Her perfect day was crumbling. She looked at James, but he was staring into the distance with a confused expression. "Margaret, why would you do this?" she finally managed to say. "This is my wedding." Margaret stared at her sister. "You mocked my life in public. For years, you've elevated yourself by hurting me. Today, you crossed a line. And I couldn't remain silent any longer." David took Margaret's hand. "We've been gathering evidence and keeping records. Records of years of emotional abuse by your family. And now Margaret is sharing the truth with millions of people." Tears glistened in Margaret's eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of liberation. The liberation of breaking years of silence and speaking the truth. She took a deep breath and spoke her next words. "For a long time, I was made to believe I was worthless. But today, I reclaim my worth. And I send a message to all those in similar situations: you are not alone. Your voice has power. And it's never too late to speak the truth." David smiled beside her. The guilt he once felt for not protecting her had now turned into pride in her strength. Robert and Evelyn sat speechless. Their perfect facade had crumbled, crushed under the weight of truth. The venue was quiet, but in the online world, a storm was raging. Margaret's brave action had ignited the hearts of millions. As the venue was engulfed in chaos, Robert finally stood up. His face was red with anger, and the veins in his temples were bulging. "This is completely inappropriate," he raised his voice. "Margaret, you always want attention. Always playing the victim. All of this is just exaggeration. No one in the family has ever hurt you." Margaret looked her father straight in the eye. "Really? Then what is this?" She tapped her smartphone and played a new recording. It contained the voice of 13-year-old Margaret and Robert shouting, "You're just stupid. Why can't you be like Victoria? She's only 11, but already much smarter than you. You're a disgrace, Margaret. A disgrace to the Wilson family." When the recording ended, Robert was speechless. Evelyn stood up, trying to smooth over the situation. This is taken out of context. Robert was just being strict for Margaret's own good. We loved her. We were just trying to toughen her up." Margaret quietly shook her head. "Love? When was the last time you hugged me? When did you ever celebrate my success?" She pointed at the screen. "Look. My channel helps millions of people. I've written books, given lectures, established a nonprofit organization. But you never once said you were proud of me. Because you didn't even know about my success." The atmosphere in the venue began to change. Many guests were expressing discomfort, and some were getting up to leave. James's parents in particular were visibly upset. James's father stood up. What kind of farce is this? Is this the family we were trying to connect with? Robert hurriedly tried to approach him, but he waved him away. No thanks. I don't want to be involved in your family issues. Margaret, maintaining her composure, spoke her next words. Everyone, this is not a farce. This is the truth. And I have legal measures prepared as well. A lawsuit for emotional abuse. She pointed at the screen of her smartphone, which displayed an email from a law firm. I've been collecting evidence for 2 years. And my lawyers say I have enough evidence. Preparations for a damages lawsuit for emotional abuse are complete. At these words, the color drained from Robert's face. As a real estate developer, he understood exactly what impact such a public scandal would have on his business. Margaret, we're family, he suddenly said, changing his tone of voice. Family matters should be resolved within the family. Margaret smiled. Now you bring up the importance of family? She continued the live broadcast and looked at David. We know what a real family is. It's not blood ties, but connections between people who respect and cherish each other. At that moment, an unexpected development occurred. James stood up and moved away from Victoria's side. Step by step, he approached Margaret. I don't intend to marry into such a family, he said, staring at Victoria. Victoria turned pale. What are you saying? This is all lies. Margaret has always just been jealous. James shook his head. I've seen how you talk about your sister these past few months. How much you despise her. And today, you've shown it in public. I don't want to spend my life with someone like that. He approached Margaret and stood before her. I respect your courage. Thank you for becoming the voice of many people who have suffered abuse. The venue fell silent again. Victoria began to cry, her perfect makeup starting to smear. Margaret took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the final truth. I must speak one more truth. About my divorce and infertility. She looked at David, who nodded. I am not a failure. The divorce wasn't because David stopped loving me, but because he couldn't stand up for me. David nodded sadly. I was weak. Seeing Margaret's family hurt her, I couldn't protect her. And I ran away from that guilt. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Margaret continued. And let me reveal the truth about infertility. She hesitated for a moment but quickly steeled her resolve. According to the doctor's diagnosis, it wasn't me who was infertile, but Victoria, who inherited Dad's DNA. At these words, a murmur arose from the venue. Victoria shuddered, and all color drained from her face. Victoria cried out. That's a lie. Margaret said quietly, when I had tests done, the doctor said there was no problem with my reproductive ability. But what about you, Victoria? I know you and James have been trying to conceive and failing. It's a medical fact, Dad's DNA abnormality is only passed to female children. At this truth bomb, Robert sank into his chair, trembling. His secret, his DNA defect, something he had always hidden, was now public. Victoria stared at her parents. Is this true? Evelyn couldn't say anything, just covered her face with her hands. This was a truth she hadn't known either. Margaret said quietly, after I got divorced, you forced me to accept the label of being a defective. But in reality, the defect was elsewhere. The venue was completely engulfed in silence. James moved away from Victoria and headed toward his parents. The Anderson family was preparing to leave together. Margaret finally turned the camera toward the viewers and addressed them. The truth can sometimes be painful. But it is the truth that sets us free. Today, I spoke my truth. And by doing so, I have become free. David held her hand and stood by her side. Members of Margaret's online community gathered around her, forming a circle of support. It was a true turning point in Margaret's life. A year later, Barnes & Noble bookstore in New York City was overflowing with people. A book signing event was being held for Margaret Wilson's new book, Silent No More. The line stretched outside the store, with hundreds of people waiting to meet her. Margaret had now become a nationally recognized advocate for survivors of emotional abuse. The Healing Hearts Foundation she established was internationally recognized and ran programs supporting abuse survivors in various locations. She regularly appeared on television and gave lectures as an expert on emotional abuse. Next to the table sat David Clark. Although they hadn't remarried, they were bound by deep friendship and mutual understanding. Together they ran Healing Hearts, each leveraging their strengths to grow the organization. "Ready for the next lecture tour?" David asked during a quiet moment. Margaret smiled. "Yes, everything's going well. Starting in California and covering 12 cities." After the signing, Margaret returned to her office. Located in a room in a midtown high-rise, it offered a beautiful view of Central Park. Looking out the window, she thought about the changes of the past year. For the Wilson family, that wedding reception had been the beginning of the end. Robert's real estate company, Wilson Estates, had lost its reputation and was forced to downsize. After his abusive behavior spread online, many business partners cut ties with him. Robert had now become a reclusive man, far from his once confident demeanor. Evelyn had distanced herself from society. Many of her former friends avoided her, and invitations had drastically decreased. Having had the ugliness behind her perfect appearance revealed, she had lost her place. And Victoria. Her engagement to James had been broken off, and she had left her father's company and moved to another town. Margaret occasionally heard rumors about her, but there was no direct contact. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by a knock from her assistant. "Margaret, someone wants to see you." The door opened, and there stood Victoria. She wasn't dressed in her previous flashy attire, but wore simple jeans and a sweater. Her face had almost no makeup, and there were signs of fatigue under her eyes. "May I come in?" Victoria asked hesitantly. Margaret, though surprised, indicated a chair. "Please." Victoria slowly sat down and folded her hands on her lap. "I read your book," she said. "It was wonderful." Margaret said nothing, waiting for her sister to continue. Victoria stumbled over her words and took a deep breath. "I came to apologize. For everything I did to you." She continued with tears in her eyes. "I'm also seeing a professional counselor. And I realized I was receiving the same treatment from Dad. I was just targeting you to avoid becoming a target myself." Her voice was trembling. "I was trying to protect myself by hurting you. It was cowardly, terrible, and unforgivable." Margaret felt conflicting emotions swirling in her chest. Years of pain and anger, and complex love for her sister. "Healing takes time, Victoria," she finally said. "But it's not impossible." Victoria looked hopeful. "Really? I don't know if we can build a relationship of trust again," Margaret said honestly. "But it's worth trying. Especially if you're trying to face yourself." The two began to talk about the possibility of this new relationship under a quiet agreement. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but a small first step. A few weeks later, another book signing for Margaret's new book, Silent No More, was held. In the long line, she continued signing, having short conversations with each reader. Next to her, as a friend and business partner, was David. And a little distance away, Victoria was modestly helping as a volunteer. While signing books, Margaret thought about the unexpected journey her life had taken. Once called a failure, she had now become a hope for millions of people. She smiled at the next reader and opened the book. Taking a pen, she began to write her trademark phrase. "Your voice has power. Don't be silent anymore." Margaret Wilson.